Yes, let me extend my best wishes to all participants in the Connectas Colloquium. I think it's very important. It's part of the process of emphasizing that the Human Rights Project is not just about top-down, but it is in particular about bottom-up and about people setting the terms for the international human rights standards. As Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, my focus is on the right to life, ways to protect the right to life, and also, if there are potential violations, to ensure that there's accountability. And so this really means that a large part of my work focuses on protest, on demonstrations, the use of force by the police. But what I like to emphasize is that that's really the last option. The most important part, I think, is really the management facilitation of demonstrations of protest. Protest is an integral part of our modern society. Its protection is important to the development of new rights, but it's a right on its own as well. It's not simply one form of freedom of expression. It really means that people can, through their bodies, through their own physical participation, can in a way claim a certain part of reality for themselves. They can express themselves in a very forceful way. And in a different way from simply just uttering words. They say, here we stand because we really think this is important. They show solidarity. They really establish new norms and new ways in which we interact with each other. So I think it's very important that the modern society and modern state looks at ways to deal with protest, with demonstrations, to facilitate it, to make sure that it happens. Of course, it is something which should in some cases be regulated and controlled. But the starting point is really that it's a basic right, and only to the extent that it is justifiable should there be restrictions on demonstrations and on protest, and of course only to the extent that it can be justified in terms of the principles relating to the use of force. May force ever be used by the state? One can perhaps think about the different parties to a demonstration or protest whose right to life may potentially be affected. Of course, there are the demonstrators, there are the bystanders, there are the police and the law enforcement officials. And all three of them are legitimate constituencies, and the better we regulate and the better we manage and facilitate demonstrations upstream, the less we have the potential that eventually a situation that may be violent or threaten property, threaten lives, may eventually occur. So from my perspective, the Human Rights Council took a resolution to ask the Special Rapporteur on Assembly Association and also myself to draft a document, recommendations concerning the management and facilitation of protest. I do think that's a very important combination, because it's not simply a question of looking at the use of force. If protest, for example, demonstrations, if that is not unnecessarily suppressed, if the state sends the message that in fact we facilitate this, we see this as a legitimate use of public space, and they may say in a particular case this should happen in this street, not in that street. They regulate the manner and form in which it takes place. And if that's done well, the right to life, I think that's the most important contribution that can be made, not just to the freedom of association, of assembly, but also to the protection of the right to life and the bodily integrity of everyone. I do think it's going to be a major part of our future. We've seen in the past that some of the most important changes that came about, social changes came about because of peaceful protest. And peaceful protest provides that avenue between simply complying with everything that happens or violent revolution, but it provides at least an intermediate stage. In many cases, the final stage that need to be done, things are addressed and society can go on, or it may postpone the use of force and perhaps reduce the level of violence that takes place. So I think it's going to be an important part of our future. The youth is the growing part of the population. There's a youth bulge. through communications. They're in touch with each other, and that's one of the modern ways of expression. As for the topics that we are looking at, of course, Mine Akiai, the Special Rapporteur on Assembly Association, looks at the ways in which protest assembly may be regulated. And then I look at the use of force by law enforcement officials, but as I've emphasized, that should really be seen as a whole. So during this year, 2015, we have different meetings. So there was one just a few weeks ago in Chile. We'll have one for Africa in August, and there will probably be one for the East later in the year, and then also in Geneva towards the end of 2015, and in 2016 we'll be presenting our report. We are assembling as much information as possible. We want this to be, as I've indicated, a bottom-up kind of approach that really draws on the experience that people have who are close to the ground. Some of the topics from my side include the use of less lethal weapons. As you know, for many years it was referred to as non-lethal weapons, but I think the experience over the last few years in particular has shown that most weapons can, in one way or another, potentially be lethal. Whether those are tasers that are used against people who are standing on walls, or tear gas that is used in a confined space. But one can hope that in some cases these weapons may be less lethal, less likely to cause death or serious injury, but they should all be treated as potentially lethal. So I think the new technology that has created all kinds of new, less lethal weapons has to be further explored. Some NGO reports just came out, and I think in a very important way deal with the kinds of less lethal weapons that are available. But it is important that those who use these weapons know about their limitations, know about their potential, and are properly trained to do so. It's also important that those engage in protests and demonstrations, that they also know about these weapons, and that they see that as part of their engagement, that they know what sort of risks they may be taking and to what sort of risks they may be exposing those who are with them engaged in demonstrations, and they may, for example, be in a leadership position, and what kind of reaction to expect in a particular case. So I think there must be more internalization of the use of less lethal weapons. I want to make it clear that I do think the emergence of more or less lethal weapons is in general a good thing. It provides the police with alternatives to using, say, live rounds. But one has to be cautious about thinking that simply because something calls itself non-lethal or less lethal, that it can be used without due care, due diligence about its potential impact. I think another topic that seems to me of importance is the increasing depersonalization of the use of force. We know about drones that are used in armed conflict and outside of armed conflict in situations of counter-terrorism. Somebody in one part of the world controls the drone and the release of force on the other side of the world. Now, that same remote control technology is increasingly finding its way into ordinary domestic law enforcement as well. And this is something which has not been thoroughly discussed and investigated. It's something of concern to me because I do think policing inherently has to be something personal. There must be a human being that assumes responsibility and is on the spot, and not only uses force but also provides protection. For example, if there are children or others who may be in harm's way, that they are there and not somewhere 100 meters away with remote control and out of harm's way themselves. There's something inherent in policing which I think is very different from armed conflict, where there's this duty to protect on the part of the police. We also know that some weapons become increasingly autonomous, that, for example, tear gas may be released in an automatic or autonomous way. That's another form of depersonalization of the use of force. And I do think that this is something to look out for, and also to make sure that we are fully engaged with that and make sure that the human rights standards are still maintained. The last thing that I want to mention is that in many cases, if one looks at the national legislation of states concerning demonstrations, concerning protest, that these laws are very outdated. They often predate the human rights era. They come before 1945, before the UN was formed, and in many cases reflect practices that we would today not regard as acceptable. I do think it's important that domestic law reform takes place, that the laws are brought more closely in conformity with the international standards. We have started a website where we put all the legislation that we can find. I think 164 or so laws are now on the website. It's www.use-of-force.info. And I would encourage everybody to have a look at that website when you can and make sure that we update that, because that can be used then by treaty bodies, it can be used by the Inter-American Commission, by the African Commission, it can be used by all the human rights monitoring bodies to see to what extent the gap between domestic law and international standards can actually be narrowed. All the best for your discussions. Thank you very much.